The global crisis was spawned in America, and the world is now trying to gauge how long it will take America to lead the way back. So there was enormous interest in US President Barack Obama's first big report to Congress and the nation today, our time. And once again, the power of his oratory shone through. An oratory that could yet prove to be as effective as any of his economic packages in rebuilding America's shattered confidence. Here's a sample.
The answers to our problems don't lie beyond our reach. They exist in our laboratories, in our universities, in our fields and our factories, in the imaginations of our entrepreneurs and the pride of the hardest working people on earth. Those qualities that have made America the greatest force of progress and prosperity in human history, we still possess in ample measure. What is required now is for this country to pull together, confront boldly the challenges we face, and take responsibility for our future once more.
But inspiration alone won't lead America back to economic health. The immediate question is, are the short-term spending and banking packages going to work, and will they be enough to get consumers spending again? Professor Ed Leamer is the director of the influential UCLA Anderson Forecast, the first major forecaster to warn in 2005 of the seriousness of America's housing bubble. He's also been a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund and Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and is Professor of Economics and Statistics at UCLA. I spoke with Professor Leamer from Los Angeles after the Obama address. Ed Leamer, to the extent that President Obama's speech to Congress and the nation can be seen as his blueprint to break the back of America's economic crisis, is he on the right track? Do Americans have good cause to walk away optimistic tonight?
Today's speech by Obama, while predictable in terms of the words he said, was really quite extraordinary in terms of the rhetoric and power of his oratory skills. This man has a potential for being one of the greatest leaders that the United States has had in a very long time. That could help, that leadership can help repair the American mood and make American consumers confident again so that we can buy homes and cars and take our families out to restaurants.
He clearly targeted banking and the flow of credit as being at the core of the current predicament, and he said, quote, "If we don't restart lending in this country, our recovery will be choked before it even begins." Are his various plans to do that, to get the money flowing again, going to work?
Well, the lending is very weak, but I don't think it's necessarily related to the weakness in the banking sector. It's because the economy is soft and there aren't great investment opportunities, and the lenders don't want to make the mistake that got us into this trouble, namely to give loans to people who can't pay them back. I don't really think that it's a credit crisis that the United States is suffering right now from. We had a huge collapse in consumer spending in October, November, and December. That collapse in spending has very little to do with credit crisis. It has to do with fear of the next depression. And as long as depression fear has gripped our consumers, there's very little that the banking sector can do to get the economy going again. We need to find some way to make American consumers optimistic again.
But you have been concerned that some of the key elements of his stimulus package are not really on the right track. What has he done that you think isn't going to work, and what should he do?
Well, what doesn't work is a tax cut. We learned that in the fall, that we learned that in the spring. A large fraction of that tax cut was actually saved, not spent. It's going to be even more so now because consumers are repairing their balance sheets. We've had this debt-driven, consumer-driven economy now for a very long time. Consumer balance sheets have taken a terrible hit, both in terms of housing assets, but also Wall Street equities and bonds. And consumers in October and November, December dramatically increased their savings. What we need to do is to find a way for consumers to cut back, to increase their spending again, or to have the government do the spending that consumers have not been doing. Cutting taxes isn't going to do it. They're just going to use that money to repair the balance sheets. The spending that has been proposed, which is infrastructure, green economy, as wise as that is from the long run, that is not replacing the lost spending that isn't there because consumers are cutting back. That lost spending, that absent spending, is in houses, cars, restaurants, retail.
Although President Obama, again in his speech, highlighted car loans, college loans, small business loans, plus a housing plan in terms of consumer spending, that doesn't do it for you?
That's good. That's in the right direction, but it's just a very small part of the whole package. I would have focused a lot on housing. We got into this trouble that we're in now because home prices are declining. We would not have had all that terrible problem in Wall Street with mortgage-backed securities if we had been able to have home prices stabilize or maybe even increase. As long as home prices are falling, the Wall Street firms are going to have tougher and tougher times because the losses on mortgage-backed securities will only mount up. Unless we do something dramatic and substantial to affect the housing sector, we're not going to have a healthy economy.
Ben Bernanke is now saying he believes 2009 will see the end of America's recession and 2010 will be a year of recovery. What's your view on when the economy starts to turn around?
Well, the recessions in the United States have typically lasted about 2 or 3 quarters. They're very short-lived. At the end of 3 quarters, you start to have economic growth, you start to ramp up employment again. And that's our view, that this is going to be one of those typical recessions. Now, in reality, the forecasting business relies on comparing today's data with historical things that are similar. But unfortunately, today's data are so unusual, there's hardly anything in the historical record that's a useful guide, which means that we don't really have forecasts, we have hunches and hopes. And that's true for Mr. Bernanke too, because he was obviously very wrong about the kind of economy we would have in the second half of 2008, as were we, for that matter.
Can you clarify to me how, on the one hand, you don't think the stimulus package is going to be as effective as you feel it needs to be, but on the other hand, you still think America will be starting to go into recovery within the next couple of quarters?
Well, the economy is this organic, self-healing system, and for all the troubles that it's in now, there are actions that are being taken on the part of both businesses and governments and individuals that will heal the economy and help it to grow. And you got to recognize that we are creating a lot of pent-up demand, unsatisfied demand, both for homes and automobiles, the critical consumer sectors that typically drive us out of these recessions. We think that the housing market is likely to bottom out within another quarter or two, and the auto sector is likely to bottom out about the same time. When that occurs, the negative growth stops, meaning that we're not growing, we're not producing fewer homes. We may not get the big bounce, a big recovery that we ordinarily do, but the relentless drumbeat of bad news and worse news and worse news, that's likely to stop pretty soon. When that happens, Americans might feel better about the future, spend a little bit more. Let's understand the unemployment rate is 7%, but that means 93% of Americans are employed. If they all feel happy and confident about their employment state, they're not going to lose their job going forward, they'll start spending more and start creating jobs for those 7% who are currently unemployed. It could get better rapidly for the same reason that fear gripped us so rapidly in September and October. It could lose its grip very rapidly as well, and we could have a better year than many people expect. You
would expect the jobs hemorrhage also to stop sometime this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been losing payroll jobs the last 2 or 3 months at the tune of 500 or 600,000 every month. And that's an enormous amount of job loss. We don't expect that to continue by the middle of the summer. We expect to see much of the job loss to be over.
President Obama has promised that he will halve the budget deficit, a huge budget deficit, by the end of his first term. Can he do that?
Boy, he gave that promise, and there were just a lot of other promises. He's going to deal with the health care issues here in this country this year, have a health care plan. He's going to deal with education. He's going to deal with energy. He's got an enormous amount on his plate. But the idea of cutting that deficit by 1/2, I think, is really one of the most difficult things that he's challenged with. Let's hope he can do it, but I don't think that's really going to occur.
You talked about Barack Obama's capacity to inspire the nation. Do you think he has the potential actually to outshine even John F. Kennedy as an orator or President Reagan as a communicator?
Well, that speech today was absolutely magnificent. I think if you read it, you wouldn't understand the power of the words, but listening to it, the way it was delivered, the responsiveness that he got from the legislators, from the Congress and the senators, it was really quite an extraordinary event to listen to. And it is uplifting. It does make me personally feel better about the future to have this sense that we have this great leader that will take America in a new direction, a new and much better direction.
Ed Leamer, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you.
And Professor Leamer watched Barack Obama's speech live on his plane from San Francisco to Los Angeles, something still working in America. Professor Leamer will be visiting Sydney for a public lecture next Tuesday for Sydney University's US Studies Centre. He'll also be meeting Treasury and Reserve Bank officials.